Good morning. This is Truth Seeker here. I thought today that I would talk about cults. I think it's an apropos subject for me because I actually belong to two cults, and this is not unusual for many people who have been born and raised in a cult to find themselves leaving one cult and entering into another cult. So I thought I'd talk a little about that and what the dangers are, because there's a familiarity, a comfort level that makes you prone, a desire, a psychological blanket that you need in a way to feel comfortable, because you've known nothing else in your life. I think this is a particularly true phenomenon with people like me who were born and raised in a cult. I know there are quite a few different definitions of a cult that have been tossed around. I have to admit that I never really read any books about escaping cults because I was already out of the cult by the time I learned about these groups, about these specialists that focus more on helping people identify that they're in a cult and that they should be exiting a cult and how to do so. I know Lloyd Evans just wrote a book about how to exit the Jehovah's Witnesses, and I'm looking forward to seeing that book. I really am very interested in it. I know that he's talked to just one moment, Stephen. Oh boy, it's bad when you get old and you freedom of mind and you don't remember things so well. Stephen Hassan. Okay, how can I be so absent-minded or forgetful? But anyway. Stephen Hassan is probably one of the foremost psychologists today. He's a guy about my age who ended up in the Moonies in the 1970s. The Moonies were quite a large group that attracted a lot of young people back in the 1970s. They handed out flowers in public places. You'd see them. They were always very easy to identify a Moonie because they stuck out so prominently, especially carrying flowers and giving flowers away in airports. And in fact, we met Moonies. My wife and I encountered some Moonies at the Jefferson Memorial. When she and I were dating in the late 70s, we often went into Washington, D.C. because she lived just outside of Washington, and we would kick around for a whole day inside the city. There's a lot of neat stuff to see, and I love museums, and the Smithsonian is an amazing museum. It's all around the different parts of the city, and so we would go to the different monuments, and that's where we encountered the Moonies. Of course, we thought they were a cult and that we weren't in a cult, which we happened to be. We were in a cult at that time, the Bible students, but we wanted to stay away from the cult, because we were just a religion. We weren't a cult. But Stephen Hassan, he runs a website called Freedom of Mind Resource Center. He's written a number of books that have been helpful to individuals. I've been through many years of counseling that have helped me. Actually, my counselor himself belonged to a cult. He, for a couple of years when he was a young man, I think they called them the family or I forget something family. It was a small fundamentalist Christian religion. They wore long beards, and anyway, he had a little difficulty exiting the cult because when he wanted to leave, the elders corralled him, and they physically prevented him from leaving the room until they were satisfied that there was no way that they could turn his mind around and convince him to remain. So to some extent, I was fortunate to find a counselor who had at least a little bit of experience, although I have to admit that the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Bible students are particularly unique cults that are extraordinarily difficult to leave. Especially when you're born and raised in it, you're raised to think that this is the truth, that the world is infused with Satan, and that you have to remain separate from the world, if not physically, certainly in other ways, to avoid going to parties, avoid different associations, friendships, and such, as much as you could, because Satan was behind everything and influencing the world. Many Bible students even homeschooled their kids. But I thought maybe I'd run through a short list, my own short list of items that, from my experience, identify a cult, and some of the general commonalities, let's say. Often, I belong to two different cults. I'll tell you, there are thousands and thousands of cults, and most of them are probably religious, but there are political cults. There are all different kinds of cults. And if you go to Stephen Hassan's website, he lists literally hundreds of organizations that meet the criteria, according to his criteria, as a cult. Now, in Stephen Hassan's view, a cult is largely an organization bent on largely mind control and undue influence, which is being able to control people's thinking through various methods and to get them to do what the cult wants them to do, to act on behalf of the cult, based on the doctrines and teachings of the cult, and that's pretty much largely the idea he has, that these people aren't really operating on their own, that they are really being being preyed upon in a way to act on. They're not thinking for themselves. I think that's the key aspect that most people who professionals who deal with cult rehabilitation go by. I think that's the fundamental commonality between cults is undue influence. But that can be done in a variety of different ways, and different organizations, different cults approach things slightly differently, but achieve the same ends. And they often, why individuals who have been in a cult find themselves in another cult shortly afterwards, is because of the comfort level, because there is this similarity, this commonality that makes them feel comfortable with the newer cult. And in my case, it was the Bible students, which I was born and raised in. I was in it for probably better than 50 years. I left probably around 2004, so that's 14 years ago now. I had questions. I also didn't feel worthy of being in the Bible students. I felt guilty for not being a good Bible student for quite a while. I had questions regarding doctrines for quite a while. I believed that they were wrong on a number of things. Yet I believed that overall that they were correct. But you can't deviate in your thinking from a cult in any way, because they will not accept your differences of opinion on certain things. There may be a little bit of leverage and latitude that they may allow, but overall, if you deviate too much, they will not consider you to be part of the truth. So, what are the things that I picked out? And this is again a kind of a short list that I've come up with. Typically, cults have a charismatic leader or group of leaders who are either dead or alive. I mean, the Bible students, there's no question that, when people call us Russellites, they were correct. We followed Russell's doctrines, although we certainly were offended by that connotation that we were following Russell. We did in fact follow Russell and his voluminous writings, and pretty much exclusively. And we believe that he was the Laodicean messenger that was mentioned in the Bible, that he was also the wise and faithful servant who fed his flock meat in due season. So we believe that there were prophetic references to Russell, that he was in Ezekiel, I think it's 11th chapter, the man with the inkhorn, and was told to write, and the proof that Russell had written so voluminously was proof that was a prophetic fulfillment from the Bible that pointed to Charles Taze Russell. But he had a charisma, that dynamic that attracted people, a certain type of person. I won't go into that, but often people are vulnerable who are attracted into cults. In the case of my grandfather, my grandfather was born in 1889. That's my paternal grandfather. He got married late in life. He was 32 when he got married in 1921. But he had joined the Bible students when he was about 18 years old, which was around 1908. And then maybe the math is a little off. I don't know. I haven't checked it, but I'm talking about rough periods of time. Now, my grandfather, he was forced to leave school. He was an only child. His mother was a very bitter and harsh woman. His father apparently was an alcoholic. And at least that was the way I was raised to believe. That was the only story and the only knowledge I had of my great-grandfather. And he left the family. I guess he and my great-grandmother were divorced. Although nobody ever really talked about it much. When my grandfather was about 10 years old, and he got no more than an 8th grade education, and then he was forced to help his mother financially. He learned the trade of tailoring. They were itinerant tailors. They moved from town to town throughout the Midwest. Opened up shop for a while, and then they would move on to another city. So he'd seen a lot of things during his life in the late 1800s and around the turn of the century in the Midwest and Great Plains areas. He remembers cow towns in Montana and the High Plains area that were depicted in the Wild West television movies and television shows and movies. He sat me down once when I was about 12 years old, and he kind of told me his life story. But anyway, growing up with his mother, who was very demanding, very bitter woman, and I guess my grandfather was really affected by growing up in a broken family, especially around then, and having all that responsibility of taking care of your mother at that age. He was approached by a coal porter when he was 18 years old, and he bought a first volume, and that's how he became associated with the Bible students. He was vulnerable, and many people are emotionally, psychologically vulnerable who are attracted into cults. There is something about the doctrines that are promoted that are attractive to individuals. There's some kind of a hope that's held out. No matter what the cult is, there is some kind of ultimate reward. There's something there that seems to make sense. Especially in religious cults, because the Bible can be very freely and openly interpreted. I mean, there are many ways that people can look at the Bible. And so there are ideas, beliefs, values, convictions that may resonate with a particular person who's vulnerable. And they join the cult, and once they've been hooked, it's kind of like fishing. Once they've been hooked, they become they're very strongly encouraged by the group to become indoctrinated as quickly as possible. They kind of force feed the individual as much as they can. Some cults have programs by which a person will climb a progressive ladder or bridge. Scientology has the bridge. There are different ways of showing progression in the indoctrination, and once you've gotten to a point where there's usually a commitment phase. I think in Scientology, after they do all this auditing, it's the critical point is when you become clear, and that is you're clear of thetans. Thetans are souls of other people who are dead that invade your body and do bad things for you and are unhealthy for you. And then the auditing process is a way or a means by which you rid yourself of these thetans. And once you've rid yourself of all thetans, you become clear. And then there are different levels beyond that. That you're climbing this bridge, and they got other levels for you to climb before you climax at a point where you'll learn the secret story of Zeno, which is not a secret anymore. But usually cults have some sort of a means by which people are indoctrinated, and in so doing this, they separate you from the world. The one thing about these beliefs, they're often very shallow, very one-sided, that if you really took a close, hard look at the beliefs, you could find the flaws, but usually you don't look that deep, because the individuals and the members who are doing the indoctrination, they control what you look at. They control your what you can and can't read. There's an isolation from the world, from your family, from other things that might lead you to question the cult, and so you're very limited in, and they focus on the information that's fed to you. They control that information, and that's all you have, and you come to believe it. It seems reasonable. I mean, human beings aren't stupid. If something wasn't somewhat reasonable, they wouldn't believe it. I mean, so there's something about it's like fishing. I mean, often the fly doesn't look anything like a real fly, but it's enough to fool the fish, and they'll go jumping after it. And that's kind of what cults are like. The beliefs appear to have some level of validity. And because of the charismatic nature of the leader, often you get caught away in an emotional tide that sweeps you away from reason. It becomes an emotional connection. So there are things like AA, for example. They have the 12 steps. I think that's a great example of a progressive things. You have a sponsor who guide you in the teachings of the 12 steps. You got the big book you got to read, and it's a quasi psychological support system. But they keep you separate from the world, because there's always this danger that you will drink again. That's the danger, and you must provide your sponsor who guides you through the steps. You go through your fourth step, which all your dirty deeds throughout your life are aired. It's kind of like the auditing, where you reveal your darkest secrets to the Scientologist auditor. And in AA, it's the fourth step. And, because there's no confidentiality clause, that you're taking a real chance. And often the sponsors and the sponsees end up the sponsee finds out that his deep, dark secrets become known among others, and that the sponsor wasn't being very confidential about his secrets. So anyway, that's part of the problem with something like AA, because at least with a professional counselor, you do have that confidentiality, that confidence that what you say to your counselor is private. I mentioned separation from mainstream society, and they do that. There are different ways that they vilify the society at large. For example, the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Bible students, they have this deleterious word, the world. I think other religions use that too. But it's not used. The connotation is derogatory. It's not a positive reference when you say the world. The world is governed by Satan, and you got to remain separate from the world. And they use Bible scriptures, of course, to emphasize this need to remain separate. And so your whole social system and structure is completely contained within the cult. This is something that the Bible students have the world. AA calls society earthlings. I don't know what Scientology calls, but they believe that people are full of thetans, and thetans aren't a good thing. So it's like being possessed by spirits, devils, spiritism, the occult. That's how Jehovah's Witnesses and Bible students would look at it, and they believe it. They believe in possession by the devil or his fallen angels. JWs call them demons. It's just a little difference in terminology, mainly because the Jehovah's Witnesses came up with their own Bible, and they changed some of the terminology in the Bible to update it, to modernize it. But many of the things that JWs are concerned with in the Bible, like the faithful and discreet slave, and who is the faithful and discreet slave? Well, that's the same thing as the wise and faithful servant, and that it's just that's the King James way of wording it, but there was always that concern as to who that wise and faithful servant was, who would feed his flock and with meat in due season. And so it's the same language, just slightly changed, modernized, but it's the same terminology. And the Bible students and the Jehovah's Witnesses have been, Watchtower Society has been mulling over that question as to who the wise and faithful servant was for 140 years. For the first 40, it was clearly Charles Taze Russell, whose pyramid monument at his grave, on his headstone, I guess, says he's the Laodicean messenger. A lot of cults do not encourage education, especially higher education, but many don't even promote lower education, grammar school, and so on, because they will learn things there that run contrary to the cult, dangerous to the cult. They would often cults will encourage homeschooling and teach the Bible as the truth towards how the world was created and salvation and what the fate of the world is and so on, Armageddon and God's judgment, and some religions have you go straight to heaven. The Mormons have you, I don't know, they seem to be all over the place. That you're at death, you're separate, your spirit's separated from your body, but then it's rejoined and judged and then separated again once you've been judged, and your spirit goes to God if you to be with God. If you're good, if you're bad, I'm not quite sure where you go. But Jehovah's Witnesses and Bible students just believe in non-existence. They reward for being faithful to the Jehovah's Witnesses is to live forever in earthly paradise for most, except for those that are in the anointed class. They are part of the 144,000. The Bible students believe that all Bible students are running for that position in the 144,000. They don't believe that there is a specific call to earth, that everybody who dies, and this is what Russell taught, that everybody who dies will get a resurrection in the 1,000 years and then be judged for eternal life in a paradise world. Whereas the Jehovah's Witnesses say that judgment is going on now, and that those who are faithful and become Jehovah's Witnesses will survive Armageddon. The rest of the world, 7.5 billion people, will die, and only those who are Jehovah's Witnesses will inherit the earth, and that will be a paradise earth. And I guess there is a belief in a resurrection, and that people who had not had the chance to hear the truth will be resurrected in the 1,000 years and given a chance to either adhere to the rules and regulations and beliefs of Jehovah's Witnesses or not. And those who aren't will go into non-existence. Bible students believe the same thing, that those who do not qualify for living in paradise earth, when they're being judged, will go into a state of non-existence. There's no burning hell of torture forever, or purgatory or any other. Either you are non-existent, or you live forever in in a paradise earth. So anyway, there is this fear of education. I remember very distinctly as a child that we had special indoctrination sessions we called children's gatherings on Saturdays, where we spent the entire day being indoctrinated into Bible student beliefs and Russell's teachings. We were warned against college, that there was no prohibition against college, but we were very strongly warned against college because those who went to college are likely to become likely to become atheists or or believe in evolution, and those were the two key things that were dangers. School, higher education also had the possibility of teaching you critical thinking, independent thinking, which was an undesirable thing. To be pleasing to God, you should give up your own will and turn your will over to God. And so independent thinking was something that was not encouraged. There are exceptions. I mean, you know, ever since science began and the scientific method began and the idea of testing hypotheses began, Galileo made the mistake of pointing a telescope up at the moon and at Jupiter and other places and writing down his observations, which ran contrary to church dogma at the time, and he got himself in trouble with the Pope and came under house arrest, and that began the war between science and religion. And for the last 400 years or so, this has been the case. Not only cults, but religion in general, very concerned with scientific education, because science has proven effects, have proven results. I mean, look at the world we live in. I mean, the things that we have, I mean, operate on the basis of science. I mean, we didn't invent these things by accident. It was the scientific method that allowed us to come to understand how electrons work and the structure of the universe at a microscopic level. Quantum theory, also we have the theory of the universe at large, the cosmos, which is the general theory of relativity, which describes gravity, and the consequences of relativity. And we depend on that theory for many different things. I mean, nuclear weapons were one outcome of, unfortunate outcome of the theory of relativity, as well as quantum theory. But the GPS and the timing must depend on Einstein's theory of relativity for time correction, because as the GPS satellites orbit the Earth, there's because of their movement over a long period of time, the clocks on the satellites slow down because of time dilation. And so that has to be corrected in order to get good position. And if there isn't a correction, you can be way off and pinpointing what you're where your location is on Earth. So there is practical results for practical application for Einstein's theory. It's not just an abstract thing that conjures up ideas of black holes and stuff that are interesting but don't have any practical use for us today. There are practical uses of theory of relativity that we derive the benefit from. I think the key thing about cults is parasitism, and that's something you don't hear too much about. It's implied, but it's not called out directly. But they're parasitic. They take from their members more than they give back. They latch themselves on like a leech, and they take. It's not a symbiotic relationship where there's a mutual benefit for both the religion or the cult and the individual. They try to make it seem that there's a benefit to you. They talk about these fictitious rewards that you might get, but really it's the cult that derives the benefit of you being a member, and they parasitize you. Usually it could be tithing, it could be money. In many cases, like in the Jehovah's Witnesses, it's time. Bible students, the same thing. The time expectations. You must attend many meetings. There's witness expectations. You need to witness. Although they don't have specific hours, it's an obligation to witness to others what your beliefs are in the Bible students. But it's mostly meetings, and they eclipse the Watchtower in terms of meetings. The Watchtower has 2-3 meetings a week for their members. Bible students can have as many as 5-6 meetings a week, and there are conventions, and there are one-day conventions, weekend conventions. There's the general convention. Every Sunday, usually it's a half a day spent at meeting. When I was a child growing up, the meeting was all day, so Sunday was gone. We would get up at 7 o'clock, leave the house by 8, got to New York City by 9. And we were in the meeting hall that we rented, the YMCA. That's why I put on that silly video. That YMCA was the place where we met. It just is my cousin pointed out that it just happened to be the same place that the Village People filmed. I thought it was ironic. But anyway, that's where we had all-day meetings. We didn't quit until 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and then we wouldn't be home until 6:30 at night. And so Sunday was gone. And how can you perform in school? How could you be expected to perform well in school when you are expected with such time demands? I mean, the justification was that the kingdom was so close that it didn't matter. That I was not going to grow up because the kingdom was just around the corner. That's how close it was, and that was a firm belief. And so my parents did not take our education and our schooling very seriously. Anyway, they were consecrated, and they forced their consecrated life on us boys. Really screwed us up, too. That's how I ended up in a second cult. I'll tell you a little about that in a minute. But yeah, the parasitism is a key thing. They draw from their members. Certainly with Jehovah's Witnesses, it's time, and then there's the punishments for those who question, who begin to question, those who haven't conformed to the principles or values in Jehovah's Witnesses. There are more sins than you could possibly list that could get you in trouble. And with Jehovah's Witnesses, they formalized that they have a book called the Shepherd the Flock of God that guide the elders how to commit judicial committees for members who sinned, and they gather the elders and they take the allegations and they take the people who are supposedly guilty and bring them in a back room and interrogate them. And I understand it's a pretty messy process. It's amateurish at best, because these are not people who are trained to do this sort of thing. They're not criminal justice system. They're not psychologists. They're not trained to do this. Bible students are pretty much the same way. When you have troubles, the elders are the ones that judge. They're the ones that question. They're the ones that counsel Bible students, individual Bible students. And if there's something, for example, there's a question of members having a homosexual relationship, they will bring this to the class, and the elders will oversee a trial of sorts, and have the person disfellowshipped. Yes, there is disfellowshipping in the Bible students. It's happened. Actually, it's happened to family members of mine. So I've had a couple of family members disfellowshipped. I've probably been disfellowshipped in absentia for my heresy and apostasy from the Bible students. But I've never been officially notified about that. Bible students aren't quite as let's say, officious as the Jehovah's Witnesses. Everything is documented and put on file. There's a file held on you, and that's one big difference between the Bible students and Jehovah's Witnesses. Although much of the culture of the Bible students has been passed down to the Jehovah's Witnesses. Some religions have physical punishments, repercussions for questioning or leaving the cult. Scientology, they hire detectives, or they have individuals follow former members. They harass them. They knock at the door. They take photographs. They follow you around, and they just generally harass you. And this could go on for years and years. And so there are physical ramifications that can occur as a result of leaving Scientology. And AA is this. What happened when I left AA? I got more phone calls from people who were trying to save me than you'd believe. It's funny, because I'd grown up and spent all my life in the Bible students, and when I finally left the Bible students, and I got one call from one elder I explained to them not to bother me until I'm thinking things through, and that not don't call me back, and I'll call you if I'm interested in returning. And I've never gotten, not even from family or friends, and I have to say I have a lot of family. Um, I've had some family contact me in the years since I've left the Bible students, but I've had essentially none, very, very little, and none of them certainly have tried to get me back. In fact, when I was in, there was many questioned my sincerity to begin with, and said, I remember when I was first thinking about becoming baptized, my cousin's husband cornered me, and he said that the jury was still out on me, and I was sincere. I was a young, confused man looking to rejoin the religion of his birth. And yet I wasn't trusted. So that hurt me. But that's how they treated things. The big thing about these is that often these religions take on a role that they're just not equipped to handle. Pseudo psychology. They're not. They're not the leaders, the elders. They're not equipped to counsel you, to judge you, to do anything about your private life. They should be telling you to go to a counselor and getting help that way, or to the correct lead you to the correct form of professional help you need. But they should not be trying to do it themselves, and yet that seems to be the case in cults. They do it themselves. Cults often have rewards, but the rewards are often things that are not seen. For example, a paradise world, or to become part of the 144,000. That's what the Bible students teach, that if you devote your life, consecrate your life to the Lord, and do everything that we tell you to do, and everything that the 6 volumes written by Charles Russell say, then you will reap a heavenly reward when you die, and you'll be part of the 144,000. Well, there's no evidence, no proof. This is all hypothetical promises that they can't guarantee. I mean, the same with the Jehovah's Witnesses. They talk about a paradise world, but how do you know that after this Armageddon that is supposed to have happened a number of times? Their predictions have failed numerous times, and yet they still have this promise of paradise, even though there's no evidence that it'll ever occur. They have no evidence that they can promise you. But anyway, those are the rewards, you see, and these are intangible rewards. They're not anything that you can really have any confidence in. But you do all of what we tell you to do. You devote your life. You do everything we tell you to do, and you will have you will have a paradise. The one thing I have to say about AA is that they indicate that you your life will improve if you follow our steps. And that's generally the case because if you are alcoholic, often your life is chaotic, and you've experienced some pretty crazy things. Your life is out of control. You've had DUIs. You've lost your license. You can't work. There are a number of things, consequences of the disease of addiction. But they say that you've got to do it our way. It's the only way to recovery, and that the reward is tangible, that your life will improve. And indeed, for many people, compared to what your life may have been before you joined AA, it often does improve. And but the problem is you're stuck within this little microcosm, this little world, and you're not allowed out. And you're afraid to go out and live in the bigger world because there's always that threat of drinking again and your life going back into chaos. So there's that fear tactic, and often the punishments involve fear. The fear of losing the promise of paradise, or the promise of being part of the 144,000. Or I remember when I was baptized, the fellow who baptized me said, "You better watch your P's and Q's, or it's the second death for you." And second death is the terminology for non-existence. It's the final punishment for incorrigible individuals who have no hope of reforming or being better, living a good life. So these rewards are often intangible, and something that they can't demonstrate, but they hold it out. And they make it so that this is your goal, and you're going to lose out if you don't hold to our precepts, to our concepts, to our lifestyle, to everything we tell you to do. You're going to lose out on all these wonderful things that we promise you. And why are cults bad? I think there are people who need cults in a way because they don't know how to live their lives independently. We got a whole spectrum in this world of individuals. Now, you can't help the circumstances of your birth. I think if you're born in a cult, you really are blameless because you don't have any other choice. Your parents, maybe your grandparents, maybe as far back as your great-grandparents. In my case, my great-grandparents on my dad's side, his mother's family went into the Bible students as far back as the 1890s. My paternal grandfather became a Bible student in 1908. My great-grandparents on my mother's side joined the Bible students around 1909 when they immigrated from Scotland. They met, the purser on the ship was a Bible student, and they began going to meetings from that point on. And my grandmother grew up from the age of 6 years old into her early teens before they left the Bible students after Charles Russell died. They did not like Rutherford, and they left, not knowing where to go or who to meet with. they just stopped going to meetings because they were so devoted to Charles Russell. It wasn't until the 1930s, before my grandmother and my great grandparents on my mother's side recontacted the Bible students, and that's a story in its own right. And I'm not going to tell it. I may have already told it at one point, but anyway, my family goes back, way back, into Watchtower history. And why are cults bad? Well, for one thing, your sense of identity. If you grow up in a cult, your sense of identity is wholly embodied within the confines of the psychological confines of the cult. How they make you feel about yourself, what you think about yourself, how you believe that you are nothing without the cult. And so your whole sense of self, your whole sense of identity is with the cult, with the Bible students. If you're not a Bible student, then what are you? So I struggled with that. What caused me to rebel as a teenager was the overbearing, the propensity of the religion to control all my life, all aspects of my life, and it was smothering. It was overwhelming. And so starting as a 13, 14-year-old boy or teen, I began to rebel, and I started drinking, I started smoking, I started secretly making friends in the world in high school, and I made it. It was harder and harder for my parents to control me. What they did was, because we lived outside of New York City, and because we're Bible students and the New York ecclesia were spread out, many of the things that happened in our home were kept secret from the class, from the Bible students' ecclesia, and so my father, he was concerned about losing his eldership. I remember when I was 17, he was particularly upset with me because my brothers were following in my footsteps, in a sense that they were also connecting with troubled kids, drinking and smoking and so on. And he blamed me for being a bad example. And he said, he told me about a friend of mine whose dad from another ecclesia had to give up his eldership because he felt that he didn't have his family under control. Now, where is it? I think it's 1 Timothy, where the qualifications for elders and deacons in the what you call it, New World Translation. It's elders and ministerial servants. Deacons are what Bible students called the ministerial servants way back before the New World Translation was written. So anyway, one of the qualifications for an elder was to have his family under control, and this one elder felt that his son, who was my friend, was not under control, and I guess to some extent I was to blame. I was considered the bad influence, bad seed, and that his father voluntarily stepped down from his eldership because he couldn't, in good conscience, remain an elder. And my father was deathly afraid that he would have to do the same thing, and he was threatening me that I needed to get my brothers and my act together, that I had to be a good influence for my brothers, and that he didn't want to have to do the same thing. It was that important to him. In fact, that was the most important thing to him, was his eldership. So anyway, I think those are the I think that some of those things are why cults are bad. They create oppressive environments for those who are in it, especially those who were born in. They cause individuals to leave members of family, especially recruits. Families become very concerned about the family member who's joining the cult, and they don't know what to do. They used to have, back in the 70s, they used to have these people that actually went out and kidnapped people who were trapped in cults, and then they would deprogram them by physically taking them and locking them in a basement, and over time working on them. It was like using brainwashing techniques to de-brainwash somebody. But yeah, they were much rougher back in the 70s in terms of how to handle people caught in cults. Today it's a little different. There are other ways of approaching it that are more effective. But yeah, cults often separate families, especially cults that shun as a punishment. And when most of the family is in the religion, shunning can be very distressing to the member who's been disfellowshipped and isolated from the rest of the family. It separates children from their parents and destroys relationships. So, yeah, cults are bad from that perspective. They use control methods for controlling the thinking of members, cult members, indoctrination. They demand time. They may demand money. They may demand both. There's strong expectations of the followers that require the followers to do unreasonable amounts of commitment to the cult. There are punishments, and there's the use of shame and reprisals for erring, for not following the precepts of the cult properly, for questioning the cult, for not adhering to the values and customs of the cult and their principles. So there are strong reprisals, and fear of these reprisals, fear of losing families, is a key thing with cults. And there's the fear of losing salvation. In religious cults, often salvation is the your permanent outcome. Your your future forever. The outlook of your future is in jeopardy, and so that is used. Fear of losing your chance for paradise or living, forever in a happy or blissful way. And members are often abused psychologically, in getting, causing members to believe that they're incomplete without the cult, especially those who are born into it, because you've known nothing different. You know nothing else other than what the cult teaches, and it can cause very strong psychological distress. I know that when I rebelled, I turned to drugs and alcohol, and that often is the case with young people who are raised in these oppressive religions, these cults. That they will turn to drugs and alcohol and abuse them, and they'll end up in pretty big trouble themselves. And while they may end up ultimately leaving the cult of their birth, they'll end up joining Alcoholics Anonymous, or joining NA, Narcotics Analysis Anonymous, or any ACOA, or any of these things that are 12-step based, that were Bill Wilson. He was the Dr. Bob and Bill Wilson. They were the two charismatic leaders who devised the 12-step program, and who had written the big book, the Bible of AA members. And meetings are always based on the writings of Bill Wilson, and it's a quasi-religion, and it constitutes a cult in its own right. And you'll find it in Freedom of Mind as listed as a cult. And I jumped into it. I mean, after I left after I was pretty much out of the Bible students, I joined the AA, and I felt guilty for that. I actually felt guilty for that I didn't have enough faith in my own religion to be strong enough to be able to kick addiction from alcohol. And but anyway, I ended up joining AA, and I started going. I was going like to 10, 12 meetings a week, and I was encouraged to do that. And if I didn't, then they shamed you, they guilted you, and they pushed you into moving along with the steps, and they urged you, and you had a sponsor who urged you to move along in the steps. And I remember having to write down my fourth step, which was all of the terrible deeds that I did in my whole life, my jealousies, all the nasty and bad things in my life. And then I had to review them on a retreat with Matt Talbot retreat with my sponsor, and spend a day with him going over my fourth step. And there are people who have written 180-page fourth steps with tables of contents, and it can get out of hand, and it puts all the blame on the individual. It doesn't look at why did the individual become an alcoholic. Well, for one thing, alcoholism is partly a genetic propensity, and alcoholism also and addiction is also a means of self-medicating from psychological damage and trauma that you don't know any other way of dealing with. Now, if I had understood about counseling and what counseling was, and getting a counselor when I was young, I damn well would have done that. But I didn't really know anything until quite late in life, and it wasn't until my neighbor, when I thought my marriage was done. He was the head of the history of science department at a local state university, and he was also a practicing lawyer. He had a law degree, and he practiced law. And so I went over to his house. My wife and I were having difficulties, and she actually left with the family, with the girls, and went to her brother's house up in Connecticut. And I thought my marriage was over. And so I thought, well, go over and see my friend. And actually, our daughters were very close friends, they still are. And I asked him, what lawyers he knew that would help me with my divorce. I was very depressed, and I really didn't think that there was any way. And he said, you don't need a lawyer. He says, what you need is counseling. And that was really the first time I had ever heard of it, and really got encouragement to do counseling. And he gave me the card of his counselor, and I began counseling. And I had 3 years of it. Things turned around quite a bit, and we dropped counseling until things started getting bad again, because I really didn't learn much from counseling. And actually, the counselor wasn't really that astute with my situation. And I found another counselor in 2002, after my brother passed away, and he committed suicide. And I've been with this counselor now since 2002, so that's 16 years. And I tell you, the change that it's made is unbelievable. Maybe counseling works for some people, maybe it doesn't for others, but for me, it helps. And because of the length of time that I was in cults, I do believe that there's a lot of damage that was done to me psychologically, and that I needed to see this guy. I still do. I may never stop needing to speak with somebody about, a professional about circumstances. But anyway, that's my own experience. That's my short list of a cult. That's my experience in cults. In a nutshell, an hour and 18-minute nutshell. I know I do go on a little bit, but I hope it's beneficial. I really am doing these things to try to help individuals who may identify or have been through it or going through it. I know that there are other young men and young people in the Bible students who even today are enduring suffering from their experience, and that they have nowhere to turn. Yeah, it happens. It happened to a lot of us, and I was very fortunate to be to have turned things around, to find help. I was fortunate. It didn't have to happen that way. My life could have really become ruined. But anyway, doing the best I can now. Things are not bad. Later today, we're going to have a little birthday party for me. I turned 63 this week, and on the actually, my birthday is on the same day as the beginning of the Civil War. I don't know if that's a bad omen or not. Also, the last Civil War veteran, I think, died the year I was born or something like that. But anyway, some crazy connections with the Civil War, coincidences. But by the same token, I'm of the Civil War generation. If I take David Splain's explanation of overlapping generations, I think that's so comical. So anyway, I wish you all the best today, and this is Truth Seeker signing out, and I don't know. Maybe one of these times I'll talk about my some of my passions. Mathematics is a very strong passion of mine, especially because of the logic involved, and I think I'm gonna maybe talk a little about Fibonacci numbers because they're so fascinating. Anyway. We'll see. Again, I hope you have a good day, and this is Truth Seeker saying so long.